So how is your ego? How is it? Is it enjoying being brought out into the open and exposed for what it is? Bring it to light and perhaps into your awareness more and your consciousness more than it had been before. And maybe you've been squirming uncomfortably in recognition of yourself in the raging, in the anger that Nebuchadnezzar exhibited, or the indulgence of Belshazzar. And that's part of the story, but the other part of the story, of course, is that there's hope, because Daniel rises up into a more prominent position over time as the stories unfold. And Daniel pictures our conscience, which is being built as we grow spiritually. And our conscience is the voice and the presence of the Lord within us that helps us to know what the right thing is and to do the right thing and to resist things that we shouldn't do. It's said to be a plane for the Lord. Like I think of it this way, sort of like going into a jungle and there's an airfield that's been cleared away where you can land a plane, that kind of an idea. There's a place where the Lord can dwell within us and make his presence known. It's also important for us to realize that our conscience is built over time. It's not just something we get and there it is. Now I have a conscience. But it's slowly built over time and it's strengthened throughout our whole life, or it can be, depending on how we live. So we can get stronger and stronger if we're learning, we're trying to act well whenever possible. So last week we had talked a little bit about how often the most challenging arena for us in our spiritual development is stopping old habits or stopping bad habits. Like we can learn what's true. It's easy to learn what's true perhaps and maybe even recognize and see the benefits of learning the truth. And we may even want to be different. We may have that desire welling up within us of wanting to change. But actually doing it is difficult. Stopping destructive behavior, stopping selfish behavior. And it's hard because we have lost many battles over it throughout our lives, I'm sure. We struggle and we fail. And it's not just the external craving of things or the desires for it. But when we try to do the right thing, there's this inner struggle that occurs, that happens within us. And the writings for the New Church call them temptations. And the thing about temptations are that we need to go through them in order to grow spiritually. They are difficult, but they are part of the building block of what makes our conscience. So Heavenly Doctrine says in several places, we cannot be regenerated unless we undergo temptations. And without temptation, we are not regenerated. So without going through these sorts of things, we just think about what we should do. We maybe want it, but we haven't actually changed our behavior. And listen to this passage that says, temptations are the means for dissolving and shaking off evil and falsity. So what's important about them is they remove the negative tendencies or inclinations that we have. They dissolve them, shake them off with interesting wording. They are also the means by which we develop a horror for evil and falsity. It's not only that, it's not only just going from a place where we crave it to a place where we abhor it, or we find it abhorrent, is a huge change. And we gain not only conscience, but strength of conscience, and this is the way that we are reborn. And part of that is that they are difficult. From our standpoint, we experience pain. So here's a passage that explains that. It says, spiritual temptations are pains of mind induced by evil spirits with those who are in goods and truths. While these spirits excite the evils which are with them, there arises the anxiety of temptation. So anxiety is one of the words that's used to explain what we experience when we're going through temptation. So if you ever wonder why maybe inexplicably you're going through a state of anxiety or concern or worry or stress or despair is another word that's thrown out quite often. It might be because you're trying to grow spiritually and you're trying to move away from it, and what you're experiencing on the inside are these temptations. Now C.S. Lewis explains it this way. I think it's from a book, Surprised by Joy, but it was put into a movie called Shadowlands, but it says, he said, God loves us, so he makes us the gift of suffering. Through suffering, we release our hold on the toys of this world and know our true good lies in another world. We're like blocks of stone out of which the sculptor carves the forms of men. The blows of his chisel, which hurt us so much, are what makes us perfect. The suffering in this world is not the failure of God's love for us. It is that love in action. For believe me, this world that seems to us to be so substantial is no more than the shadowlands. Real life has not yet begun. So a little think about, we are going to go through things in our life, spiritual trials, things that help us to grow, but they are difficult. So let's remember back to how things were at the beginning of this story of Daniel. Nebuchadnezzar, the king, had a firm grip on everything. He was like a god, if not externally in his own mind anyway. He was in charge of everything, and he could do what he wanted. And if people didn't obey him, his favorite thing was to cut them in pieces and burn their house to the ground. So sort of a angry disposition or a self-centered disposition. You don't do what I want, I will cut you in pieces and I will burn your house to the ground. Okay. That was his picture. And that picture is our ego, or what the writings for the New Church call our proprium, in a selfish state, or a state where it's not changed, or where we don't have our conscience yet, put it that way. But in that first story, Daniel, Hananiah, Azariah, and Mishael, otherwise known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, were willing to question what was being asked of them. They were to eat all those delicacies that the king had. That they said, can we just instead have vegetables and water for 10 days, and if we're okay, can we continue to do that? And the person who was in charge was a little resistant because he knew the temperament of Nebuchadnezzar, but he agreed to it. And after 10 days, they came back and their faces were shiny, they were radiant, and they pictured, for us, it pictures how we need, when we go to the truth and we take that into our lives instead of any other information, then it can change who we are. But think about it from the story itself, just that little crack of rebellion maybe, or questioning the authority of the ego or the king in this case, creates a huge divide. And as time goes on, more and more Daniel becomes more prominent. It gets more consulted over and over as these stories unfold. So when we stick to what is right in our own mind, because we've learned it from the truth, from the Lord's word, then we become strengthened and we grow. Till finally Daniel becomes a governor. He's one of the people governing the land. So you think about him in relation to our conscience. Our conscience is going from a place of very young, as he is in the story, sort of testing the waters and slowly making himself known to the point where he is one of the governors of the land. Now Belshazzar, he came and went last week in that one chapter, and so we're not going to talk about him anymore today. But Darius is now king. So we've gone from Nebuchadnezzar to Belshazzar to now Darius the king. Daniel is still around, however. But notice the progress, though. Daniel was only brought in when there was a crisis. When there was a situation, they would bring Daniel in, and Daniel could interpret a dream or tell the king what the writing on the wall meant, something like that. But now he had been elevated to a position of power, and he was even being considered by King Darius to be the first governor, the one in charge of everybody else. But that doesn't mean the battle is over yet. There's still work to do, because conscience is starting to take charge in our life, but it's not without resistance. So we think of Darius as our ego or proprium, the part that the satraps talk to and convince. It's important for us to pay attention that our ego or our proprium is still vulnerable to being swayed by self-interest. It's easily manipulated, and we need to be aware of that. Because part of us, even though conscience or Daniel is rising up in power, part of us can still be easily seduced back into those hurtful behaviors. If you ever wonder about that in your own life, it's like, well, I thought I was making progress. I was doing really well. And then I got dragged back. Has that ever happened? Absolutely. It happens all the time, right? Because we're in process. But there's part of us that we need to be mindful of its weakness. So that's what's pictures in the story. So if our ego is going to get something from it, we're interested. Like, oh, you're going to praise me? Or, oh, everyone in the kingdom's going to bow down, or they're going to petition or pray to only me, or no other God, no other people in the whole land for 30 days? That sounds pretty nice. So he didn't really think it through. He's just like, oh, so everyone's going to turn to me? That sounds good. Just like our ego can, if someone's going to just, flatter us, we're like, oh, I guess that feels good. And we kind of overlook the fine print, so to speak. Whereas Daniel, he doesn't change. He's consistent. He was praying before this law was written. He continues to pray to the Lord after the law is written. So when the law is written and declared, he goes right home, it says in the story, and he prays 3 times that day as usual. To me, it's a simple message of stick with your program. Stick with what you know is right, even in the face of a challenge. The temptation is to, I might get harmed in some way, or things might not work out for me, so I better change, even though I know it's wrong. Act with integrity, do the right thing, you know it's the right thing. Now, I've heard many people say, maybe not many, maybe a few people say that no good deed goes unpunished, right? Some of them are in the room, and that's all right. No good deed goes unpunished. It's sort of a philosophy of life, and it's kind of cynical, but it's I don't know if they really mean it, but I wanted to address that a little bit today because we can feel that way. Because here's Daniel, he does the right thing, and he gets thrown in the lion's den anyway. And so it can feel that way, right? You do the right thing, and now I have to suffer. But think about it in relation to doing the right thing versus doing the wrong thing, or the thing you know you shouldn't do. And that kind of plays out in this story. You can see how things end up for Daniel. Yes, he did the right thing. He ended up in a den of lions, but he was fine. How about for his accusers who did the wrong thing? And they thought, oh, great, Daniel, who's in our way, is going to be gotten rid of. And they were probably cheering when he was thrown into the lion's den and just waiting till the morning so they could, maybe one of them could take Daniel's position of power. Finds out in the morning Daniel's fine, that those satraps had actually tricked Darius. They said all of the governors and all the satraps have agreed that this is the thing, and Daniel didn't agree to that. So they kind of tricked him. But in the morning, when it's found out that Daniel was fine, Darius has them thrown into the den of lions instead. It said, I didn't want to necessarily read this with the children, but their families, their wives, and their children were all thrown into the den as well, and all of them, their bones are broken before they even reach the bottom of the den, torn apart by the lions. So it's not that the lions weren't hungry when Daniel was in there. That was not the issue. So we do the right thing, we do go through a challenge, but we come out better than we were. If we do the wrong thing, it may seem like things are great for us, but there's always a sting attached. There's always a hurt that follows. So we just pay attention to it. It's laid out very clearly in this story. Yes, a person of integrity will suffer temptations, but temptations are part of our spiritual growth. We have to go through them in order to grow. But we will come through on the other side stronger than we were. Whereas a selfish person will lose things that are important to them. They'll lose true happiness because they attach it to the wrong thing. They want power for themselves, and they ended up losing their lives instead. We see it in Darius as well. He spent the night too. He couldn't eat, he couldn't sleep, he didn't have any entertainment because he refused it and he had regret over what had happened. So temptations, we think of them as bad things, but they're actually good things because they help us to grow. Being in the state of temptation, however, doesn't feel like a good thing. Just to be clear, it doesn't feel good, but it leads to a state of freedom. But thinking about in times of temptation, though, the king, our ego, couldn't save Daniel. That's important to remember, that don't go back to the ego for the solution. Daniel himself, it's interesting when he is, when they go to him and they tell the king that, he's been praying, he needs to go in the lion's den, he doesn't defend himself in any way. He doesn't say, he doesn't try to argue himself out of it. He doesn't say anything. He just gets cast into the den of lions. And part of that, I think, illustrates the fact that the Lord knows that, or we ought to know that in a state of temptation, we shouldn't ask to have the temptation removed. Because what we're asking for is something good to stop. We need to ask for the strength to get through the temptation. Lord, help me to get through this ordeal so I can come out the other side. There's a passage that says prayers in temptation are seldom heard, because what we're asking for is something, asking the Lord to remove it from us rather than lead us through it. And it's like us going to the dentist and the dentist saying, you've got to get this tooth filled. And And the dentist saying, oh, and us saying, well, I don't want to do it. Or we're in the middle of being drilled, and we say, oh, please stop. Stop, I don't want to go through with it. The dentist knows she's not going to let you go out the door with a big hole in your face, because that's not good. It would be better if we actually completed the work. Then you could leave the office and you would be cured. I know it's not enjoyable. If I do that, people don't like the sound of those drills, right? It's kind of like start to get the willies, but if we get through it, we'll be in a better place. So prayers and temptation are seldom heard, but temptations solidify our efforts to do the right thing. Our conscience is built by learning what's true, building an affection for what's good, really wanting to do the right thing, and then comes the question of, really? Are you really going to change this? Are you really going to change this about yourself? Are we really going to make this change? Because when we actually change our behavior, we are inviting the Lord's closer presence, which is great. That sounds great. The Lord's closer presence is good, but there's also the presence of evil spirits with us from the other side, and they can't stand the Lord's presence. It makes them very uncomfortable, and they don't want us to, so to speak, leave their presence and be closer to the Lord, because they enjoy messing with us. They enjoy causing us to suffer. They enjoy causing us to mess up. It's kind of like we're paying them overpriced rent in a bad neighborhood, and they don't want to lose that. Like, no, well, you just stay with us. So they hold on tight, and there's a battle between whether we're going to actually advance and be closer to the Lord, or whether we're going to stay where we were. And that battle that's going on, a spiritual battle, we experience as the words that the writings use for it are depression, anxiety, despair, those kind of feelings that come up. And we may not even know what it is we're dealing with, but we are in that state. But if we can work through it, as the wording was, evils and falsities with us will be dissolved and shaken off and removed. And I'm sure you've experienced this in other parts of your life too, when you've been working on a habit and you've gotten distance from it, its power over you starts to lessen. It starts to seem like less of a thing. Like, I used to be so into that or so hooked by that, and now not really so much. What's cool about the story too is at the end of the story, after King Darius comes and Daniel's fine and he pulls them out of the den, he makes this decree realizing that, Daniel's God is the right God. He says, I make a decree that in every dominion of my kingdom all must tremble in fear before the God of Daniel. For he is the living God and steadfast forever. His kingdom is the one that shall not be destroyed, and his dominion shall endure to the end. He delivers and rescues, and he works signs and wonders in heaven and on earth. For he has delivered Daniel from the power of the lions. So a huge change in perspective. The king at the beginning could care less about Daniel or his God or anybody's God. It was all about himself. And now he says, you must honor and respect this king. So really it's about, what are we going to listen to? Are we going to listen to those voices of ego and self-interest, or are we going to listen to the voice of the Lord that's being built in our conscience? I like this little story from called Two Wolves, which perhaps you've heard before, but it says, one evening, an elderly Cherokee brave told his grandson about a battle that goes on inside people. He said, my son, the battle's between two wolves inside us all. One is evil, it is anger, envy, jealousy, sorrow, regret, greed, arrogance, self-pity, guilt, resentment, inferiority, lies, false pride, superiority, and ego. The other is good. It is joy, peace, love, hope, serenity, humility, kindness, benevolence, empathy, generosity, truth, compassion, and faith. The grandson thought about it for a minute and then asked his grandfather, which wolf wins? The old Cherokee simply replied, the one that you feed. Simple example. What do we feed? What do we pay attention to? This is really one of the most simple and beautiful stories of the Lord's Word about trust. It's simple. Do we, like Daniel, have a habit of asking the Lord for help? Do we make it part of our lives? I try to ask people to read the Word every day, pray every day, try to be useful in some way every day. Do we have those kinds of habits built up in our life? And we trust in the Lord even though there are times when we are going to go through a struggle. We continue to do that work, and we will get through it. And you'll say, well, when will I get through it? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know when you'll get through it, but you'll get through it. We always want to know when it's going to stop. We always want to know when the pain's going to be over, but it'll be over when it's over, when we get through it and get to the other side. But continue to pray and ask for help and do your work. One more quote from Shadowlands with C.S. Lewis here. Someone's talking to him about how hard it is. His wife has cancer and she's dying, and this person says, Harry says to him, I know how hard you've been praying, and now God is answering your prayers. And C.S. Lewis says, that's not why I pray, Harry. I pray because I can't help myself. I pray because I'm helpless. I pray because the need flows out of me all the time, waking and sleeping. It doesn't change God. It changes me. I love that little idea that prayer doesn't change God, it changes us. And the Lord doesn't want anything but what's good and wonderful for each one of us. And sometimes He'll allow us to experience hardship for the sake of our eternal happiness. But it doesn't change any of that. What changes is our perspective and our ability to work through it. And remembering that we don't have any power to do that on our own, to fight on our own, so we have to ask the Lord for help. One more passage from the Heavenly Doctrine says, unless we approach the Almighty God, we can do no more against evil and so falsity than a fish against the ocean, a flea against a whale, or a speck of dust against an avalanche, much less than a locust against an elephant, or a fly against a camel, or a person against a pride of lions, however you want to look at it. We have no power against those things of ourselves. So temptations aren't easy, but they're essential. But the net effect is freedom and happiness. Removal of bad habits that have their grip on us and bring us unhappiness. So it's worth going through the valley of the shadow of death that we may get through to the other side. So the name of this campaign has been Love Over Ego. We think about Daniel picturing conscience or the presence of the Lord and love within us. He has now taken his position. And it says at the end of this chapter, so this Daniel prospered in the reign of Darius and in the reign of Cyrus the Persian. Conscience begins quietly, and it grows and grows as we feed it, and it does the work. And at some point, it becomes so strong with us that we can't act against it because it's our true self. We can't go against our conscience. Amen.